The air inside the saloon hung heavy with the acrid smell of spilled whiskey, sweat, and fear. Oil lamps cast long, dancing shadows across the weathered wooden walls, and the piano had fallen silent several minutes ago. Every eye in the establishment was fixed on the scene unfolding near the bar. A burly man with scars crisscrossing his face and a pistol hanging from his belt had grabbed a young woman by the arm. She had green eyes that sparkled with tears and wore a torn dress that had seen better days. She trembled violently. He smiled with cruel satisfaction. "Please, don't kick me," she begged, her voice breaking as she desperately tried to wrench herself free from his iron grip. But the man only tightened his hold, raising his hand to strike her again. Nobody moved. Nobody said a word. Fear had transformed everyone present into statues of salt, frozen in their places, unable or unwilling to intervene. Then the saloon doors burst open with such force that they slammed against the walls. A stranger entered slowly, his hat pulled low over his eyes, his spurs ringing against the wooden floor like death bells echoing through a cemetery. He wore a long, dusty coat, stained with desert dirt, and carried a silver revolver on his hip that gleamed under the dim light filtering through the smoke-filled room. He said nothing at first, just walked to the bar with measured, deliberate steps that seemed to count down to something inevitable. He ordered a whiskey and drank it in one swift motion, never taking his steel-grey eyes off the man holding the girl. The burly man looked at him with contempt and mockery dancing in his cruel eyes. "You got a problem, stranger," he growled, his voice rough as sandpaper. The stranger set his glass down on the bar with a sharp crack that resonated through the silence. Then, with a calm that chilled the blood of everyone present, he responded, "Yes, you." The saloon fell into a silence so profound that the heartbeat of every person present could be heard pounding like drums in the stillness. The burly man shoved the girl away roughly, sending her stumbling to the floor, and moved his hand toward his weapon. But before he could draw it from its holster, the stranger already had his revolver pointed directly at the man's chest, the hammer cocked and ready to fire. "Drop the weapon and get out of here before I change my mind," the stranger said, his voice carrying the weight of absolute certainty. The air became so heavy it was painful to breathe. Everyone knew in that moment that this man hadn't come just for a drink. He had come to deliver justice. It was the year 1878, and the wind in the town of Redstone carried the taste of dust and dried blood. The saloon, known as the Broken Horseshoe, was the heart of the place, a haven where men drank to forget, gambled to survive, and died when their luck ran out. Nobody asked where you came from. Nobody talked about tomorrow. Only the present mattered, and who had the fastest gun. But that night, something changed forever in Redstone. The man who had just entered wasn't like the other drunks and cowboys of the territory. He had been riding for days under the unforgiving Arizona desert sun, and his face bore the marks of the trail. Several days' worth of stubble covered his jaw, his eyes were grey like tempered steel, and his gaze spoke volumes more than 1,000 words ever could. He wasn't a common bandit. He wasn't a small-town sheriff either. He was something in between, something far more dangerous. The girl who had been pleading was named Clara Morales. She was barely 20 years old and worked in the saloon serving drinks, cleaning tables, and enduring the insults of drunk men who thought they owned the world. But the man who had been hitting her, a brute known as Bull Harding, was the true terror of Redstone. Nobody dared to challenge him, not even the sheriff, who preferred to look the other way when Bull was conducting his business. Bull was built like a bear, brutal as a hungry wolf, and had a reputation for having killed more than 10 men. Some had died in fair duels, others simply because he felt like it or because they looked at him wrong. His presence alone was enough to clear a room, and his temper was legendary throughout the territory. But the stranger didn't seem impressed in the slightest. His calm demeanor suggested he had faced worse men than Bull Harding and lived to tell the tale. "Who the hell are you?" Bull snarled, his hand still dangerously close to his Colt .45. The stranger didn't answer immediately. He just looked at Clara, who was still trembling on the floor like a leaf in a storm, then turned his gaze back to Bull with undisguised contempt burning in his eyes. "Someone who doesn't tolerate cowards who beat women," he said simply, each word falling like a hammer blow. Bull laughed, but his laughter sounded false and nervous. Everyone in the saloon noticed it. The change in atmosphere was palpable. Bull Harding might have been many things, but he wasn't stupid. He knew how to recognize a professional gunslinger when he saw one face to face, and the man in front of him was different from any drunk or cowboy he had ever known. There was no fear in his eyes, the kind Bull was accustomed to seeing in his victims. He didn't hesitate for a second, didn't sweat nervously. He just waited with deadly patience, like a coiled rattlesnake ready to strike. "You don't know who you're messing with, stranger," Bull said, trying to sound threatening but failing to achieve the menacing tone he was aiming for. His voice no longer carried the same arrogant confidence as before. The cracks were beginning to show. The stranger shrugged with calculated indifference, a gesture so casual it was insulting. "I know exactly who I'm dealing with, friend. A cowardly bully who beats defenseless women because he doesn't have the guts to face someone his own size." The words fell like heavy stones into a still pond, sending ripples through the crowd. Some men in the saloon exchanged nervous glances. Nobody, absolutely nobody, dared to speak to Bull Harding like that. Nobody who wanted to keep breathing anyway. Bull gritted his teeth with barely contained rage, his jaw muscles working as he fought to control his temper. Slowly, deliberately, he moved his hand toward the revolver hanging from his belt. But before he could even touch the handle, the stranger moved with a speed that cut through the air like a sharpened knife. In an impossible blink, his silver weapon was out of its holster and pointing directly at Bull's sweating forehead. "Don't do it," he said in a low but firm voice, solid as mountain rock, "because if you draw that pistol right now, I swear to God you'll never draw another one again." The saloon remained in absolute sepulchral silence. Even the old wall clock didn't dare to tick. The bartender held his breath, his hands frozen in the act of wiping a glass. The poker players had left their cards on the table, forgotten in the tension of the moment. And Bull Harding, for the first time in many years, felt something he had long forgotten. Pure, unadulterated fear coursing through his veins like ice water. Bull swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing visibly. His large, scarred face turned red as a ripe tomato, an explosive mixture of contained anger and deep humiliation. Slowly, very slowly, he raised his thick hands and moved them away from his weapon as if it burned his fingers. "Very well," said the stranger, without lowering his revolver even a millimeter. "Now get out of here immediately, and if you ever touch this girl or any other woman in this town again, I'll come looking for you. And the next time we meet, I promise you, I won't be so kind or merciful." Bull cast one last murderous look, filled with hate, before leaving the saloon with heavy steps that made the floorboards tremble under his weight. The door closed behind him with a sharp bang that echoed off the walls. Some men sighed in relief, others simply stared at the stranger with a mixture of respect and fear. The stranger holstered his weapon with professional calm and turned toward Clara, who was still on the floor, trembling like a leaf in a storm. He extended his hand to her with a gentle gesture that contrasted sharply with the violence that had just transpired. "Are you all right, miss?" he asked, his voice now soft and concerned. She looked at him with green eyes full of tears and genuine astonishment. Who are you, sir?" He didn't answer the question. He just helped her to her feet carefully, making sure she was steady, then returned to the worn wooden bar where he ordered another whiskey from the bartender, who was still paralyzed with surprise. While he drank in absolute silence, everyone in the saloon knew one thing with deadly certainty. That mysterious man had just signed his own death warrant. Bull Harding never forgot an offense, and never ever in his violent life forgave a public humiliation like this one. The night was just beginning in Redstone, and before dawn, blood was going to flow through the dusty streets of the town like a raging river. Everyone knew it. Everyone could feel it in their bones. Night fell heavy on Redstone like a blanket of molten lead. The stranger rented a small room on the upper floor of the saloon and climbed the creaking stairs without saying a word. Clara watched him from the bar, still trembling from everything that had happened that terrible night. Nobody else in the saloon dared to look at him directly. It was as if they had seen a vengeful ghost walking among the living. But Bull Harding wasn't the kind of man who forgot offenses, much less one who forgave public humiliations. On the outskirts of town, in a ramshackle cabin surrounded by empty whiskey bottles and sun-bleached bones of dead animals, Bull gathered his trusted men. There were 6 of them in total, rough, dirty men without scruples or morals. They had ridden with Bull for long years, stealing cattle, killing witnesses, and spreading absolute terror throughout the Arizona Territory. "There's a man in the town saloon," Bull said while meticulously cleaning his Colt 45 revolver. "A damned meddling stranger who doesn't know when to keep his mouth shut and his nose out of my business. I want us to give him a lesson tomorrow morning that he'll never forget." One of the men, a thin, nervous type with a horrible scar over his left eye, smiled, showing rotten teeth. "Do we kill him right away, boss?" Bull reflected for a long, tense moment, his fingers running over the cylinder of his gun. Then he nodded slowly with cold decision. "Yes, we kill him. But first, I want that bastard to suffer like a dog. I want him to know perfectly well what it costs to mess with Bull Harding in his own territory." The men laughed like hyenas and toasted noisily with cheap whiskey and moonshine. But one of them, the youngest of the group named Jesse, didn't seem so sure or convinced. He had seen with his own eyes how the stranger had drawn his weapon. The memory made him very nervous. Meanwhile, in his narrow room on the second floor, the stranger sat by the dusty window, gazing at the bright stars in the night sky. His silver revolver rested on the wooden table, perfectly clean, oiled, and fully loaded with 6 bullets. He didn't sleep peacefully. He never did in dangerous places like this. He had learned many years ago through bitter experiences that death always came when you least expected it. And that dark night, he knew with absolute certainty it was coming straight for him. A soft knock on the wooden door abruptly pulled him from his deep thoughts. He got up with silent care, took his weapon with a firm hand, and approached slowly. "Who is it?" "It's me, sir, Clara Morales." He opened the door cautiously. She stood there holding a metal tray with hot food and a look full of sincere gratitude in her green eyes. "I thought you might be hungry after everything, sir." He looked at her for an evaluating moment, then nodded briefly and let her into the room. She carefully set the tray on the table and stood there, nervous and not knowing what to say. The silence stretched between them like a chasm. "Thank you for what you did tonight in the saloon," Clara said in a low, trembling voice. "Nobody, absolutely nobody, had ever done something like that for me in my entire life. Everyone is too afraid of Bull." The stranger said nothing in response, just ate in absolute silence, slowly chewing the hard bread and dried meat. Clara watched him for a long time, studying his weathered face, the lines around his eyes that spoke of hard years and harder choices. "Why did you do it, sir? Why did you risk your life for someone you don't even know?" He stopped eating and looked toward the dark window, his eyes distant, seeing something beyond the glass. "Because someone had to do it, miss. And because a long time ago, when I needed it most, nobody did it for me." Those words hung in the night air like cigar smoke, heavy with meaning and old pain. Clara wanted to ask more, to understand this mysterious man who had appeared from nowhere to save her, but something in his expression told her that some stories were better left unspoken. Dawn arrived with a sky dyed blood red, an omen that everyone in Redstone recognized. The stranger came down the creaking stairs early, his dusty coat well adjusted, and his black hat pulled low over his grey eyes. The saloon was completely empty except for the old white-mustached bartender who was cleaning dirty glasses with a worried expression on his wrinkled face. "You should get out of here while you can, stranger," said the bartender without looking up from the glass. "Bull Harding isn't going to let this go so easily. I've known him for 20 years, and I've seen what he does to those who cross him." The stranger poured himself a steaming black coffee and sat calmly by the dirty window. "I know perfectly well what's coming." "Then why in hell are you staying here waiting?" the bartender asked, finally looking up with disbelief in his eyes. He looked outside, where the red sun was beginning to slowly illuminate the dusty streets of the town. The early morning light painted everything in shades of orange and gold, beautiful and ominous at the same time. "Because someone has to make a stand, old man. Someone has to say, enough is enough." The bartender shook his head repeatedly, a gesture of resignation and sadness. "You're a dead man, stranger, a dead man walking." "Wouldn't be the first time someone's told me that," the stranger replied, taking another sip of his coffee. Outside, the town of Redstone was beginning to wake up gradually. Some merchants were opening their stores with squeaking shutters. Some barefoot children ran happily between the wooden carts, their laughter a strange counterpoint to the tension building in the air. Everything seemed normal and peaceful, but the stranger knew perfectly well it was a false and deceptive calm. The storm was coming, and then he saw them clearly in the distance. 6 men on horseback entering the dusty town, with Winchester rifles in hand and murderous expressions on their faces. Bull Harding rode at the front of the group with a cruel, vengeful smile on his scarred face. They stopped right in front of the saloon and dismounted slowly, deliberately, making noise with their spurs, each movement calculated to intimidate. The bartender paled like paper. "Holy God, they're going to kill you right here." The stranger stood up with absolute calm and walked toward the wooden door. "Not if I kill them first, friend." He stepped out onto the porch under the rising sun, and death awaited him in the street with 6 different faces. The stranger descended the porch stairs without any hurry, with measured and confident steps. He stopped exactly 10 meters away from the group of armed men. The bright morning sun was at his back, giving him a small visual advantage. In the West, any minimal advantage could mean the difference between living and dying. "Meddling stranger!" Bull shouted, his voice filled with hate. "Come out and face your destiny like a real man if you have the guts." The stranger crossed the dusty street with unsettling calm. His right hand rested near his silver revolver, ready but not threatening. Not yet. 6 armed men against 1, he said with a calm but clear voice that carried across the street. "So this is how brave men fight in Redstone." Bull laughed with contempt, but the sound rang hollow. "This is how idiots die who stick their noses where they don't belong." The stranger smiled slightly, just a small movement at the corner of his lips. "Then I guess we're going to find out today who the real idiot is here." Some townspeople were beginning to peek through closed windows. Others hid behind half-open doors. Everyone knew they were about to witness a massacre. The only question was, who would end up dead in the dust? Bull spat on the ground with contempt. "Let's end this once and for all." The 6 men spread out slowly, forming a threatening semicircle around the stranger. It was a classic tactic: surround him completely, so he would have no possible escape. But the stranger didn't seem nervous or scared at all. His grey eyes moved constantly, calculating distances, angles, and speeds with mathematical precision. Every exit, every cover, every possible move was being catalogued in his mind. Jesse, the youngest of the group, swallowed nervously. Something in the stranger's relaxed posture told him this man had survived worse situations. Much worse. There was a confidence there that couldn't be faked, the kind that only came from walking through fire and coming out the other side. Bull moved his hand to his revolver. The other 5 men did the same, their movements almost synchronized. The air became so dense it hurt to breathe. Time seemed to slow down, each second stretching like molasses, and then everything exploded in violence. The first shot resonated like thunder in the tense silence of the morning. Bang! One of Bull's men fell heavily from his horse with a choked scream, clutching his bleeding shoulder. The horses neighed in fear at the noise, and absolute chaos erupted in the dusty street. Bull and his remaining men drew their weapons clumsily, but the stranger had already moved with incredible speed. He ran toward a large water barrel and took cover behind it, firing with deadly, calculated precision. Bang! Bang! 2 more shots cut through the air. Another man fell screaming, blood staining the dusty ground beneath him. "Surround him!" Bull shouted, furious and desperate. "Don't let that bastard escape alive!" The men scattered quickly, trying to approach from different strategic angles. But the stranger knew this deadly game perfectly. He had survived worse gunfights than this. He knew exactly how to move between shadows, how to control his accelerated breathing, how to wait patiently for the perfect moment to shoot. Jesse, the youngest of the group, was hidden behind a wooden cart, trembling like a leaf. Never in his short life had he seen someone move like that in combat. It was as if the stranger knew exactly where his enemies would be before they themselves knew it. Every movement was calculated, every shot deliberate. There was no wasted motion, no panic, just deadly efficiency. Another accurate shot. Bang! A 3rd man fell heavily, his scream cut short as he hit the ground. Bull cursed loudly and fired several times toward the barrel, splinters of wood flying through the air, but the stranger was no longer there. He had moved silently toward the side porch of the saloon, using the deep shadows of the morning to completely cover himself. "It's just one damned man!" Bull shouted, his voice increasingly desperate, the confidence of earlier completely gone. "Kill him now!" But his words sounded less and less convincing. The men who were still alive exchanged nervous glances. They had completely underestimated this silent stranger, and now they were paying the price in blood. The street of Redstone was quickly becoming a cemetery. The stranger suddenly emerged from the dark shadows of the porch and fired again with surgical precision. Bang! Another wounded man fell to his knees, moaning in pain, his weapon falling uselessly from his hand. Now there were only 3 left: Bull Harding, young nervous Jesse, and a burly guy with a black beard named Frank. Frank, blinded by rage and fear, charged toward the stranger with a wild scream, firing his revolver without control or aim, bullets flying wildly in all directions. But the stranger ducked with feline agility, rolled across the dusty ground, and fired twice with deadly calm. Bing! Bang! Frank stopped dead in his tracks, looked down, and saw blood gushing from his chest, spreading across his shirt like a crimson flower. He fell heavily like a felled tree, raising a cloud of dust as he hit the ground. Jesse dropped his rifle to the ground with a clatter and raised his trembling hands above his head. I surrender, please!" The stranger looked at him for a long moment, evaluating whether it was a trap. Jesse's eyes were wide with terror, tears streaming down his young face. Then he nodded briefly. "Get out now. Get on your horse and never come back to this town again." Jesse didn't wait for a second invitation. He ran desperately toward his brown horse and galloped out of town without looking back even once, dust clouds marking his frantic retreat. Now, only 2 men remained standing in the blood-stained street, the stranger and Bull Harding. Bull was breathing heavily like a wounded bull, with the revolver still firmly in his large hand. His scarred face was completely red with contained anger and deep humiliation. Everything he had built, his reputation, his power over the town, was crumbling around him. "This doesn't end here, damn stranger," he growled. "Even if it costs me my life, I'll see you dead." The stranger reloaded his weapon with mechanical, precise movements, each bullet sliding into place with a soft click. "Yes, Bull, it ends exactly here and now." Both men stared at each other. The wind blew gently between them, lifting small clouds of dust that danced in the morning light. Neither moved, neither blinked. It was a contest of wills as much as it was of guns. And then, at the exact same time, both raised their pistols toward the sky. The final duel had begun. Only one would walk away alive. The sun shone intensely behind the stranger, partially blinding Bull Harding. It was a small advantage, but crucial. In a duel to the death, any minimal advantage could mean the difference between walking away or being buried. The two men looked at each other fixedly, their fingers brushing the metal triggers of their weapons. The wind blew again, lifting red dust from the street. Nobody else dared to leave their houses. The town windows were full of pale, frightened faces, watching from the relative safety of their homes. Clara stood on the high porch of the saloon with her hands over her mouth, holding her anguished breath. "You're good with a pistol, I'll give you that," Bull said with a hoarse, broken voice. "But you're not invincible, stranger. Nobody is." The stranger didn't respond. He just waited patiently, his grey eyes never leaving Bull's face. Bull gritted his teeth hard, his jaw muscles working. "I'm going to kill you myself, and then I'm going to kill that meddling girl, and there won't be absolutely anyone in this miserable town who can stop me." Those threatening words were his fatal mistake. They revealed his intention, telegraphed his move. The stranger's hand moved in an impossible blur of pure speed. Bang! The shot cut through the dry air like a deadly whip. Bull didn't even have enough time to squeeze his own trigger. The bullet went through his chest with perfect precision and made him stagger backward. He fell heavily to his knees, with his eyes wide open in surprise and disbelief. His revolver slipped from his sweaty hand and fell to the ground with a dull, definitive thud. You, he muttered weakly before collapsing face down in the red earth. The stranger blew the smoke coming from the hot barrel of his weapon and slowly holstered it. He looked around calmly. The wounded moaned weakly. The dead lay motionless under the sun, and the heavy silence finally returned to the town of Redstone like a blanket of peace. Slowly, the wooden doors began to open with nervous creaks. People emerged with extreme caution, looking at the bodies lying on the ground, and at the stranger with a strange mixture of reverent fear and deep admiration. What they had witnessed was already becoming legend. The town sheriff, an older man with a grey mustache and a rusty badge, finally appeared, walking nervously toward the stranger. His boots raised small clouds of dust with each uncertain step. I should formally arrest you for this, stranger. It's my duty," he said, though his voice lacked any real conviction. The stranger looked at him with absolute calm. "Then do it, Sheriff. Here I am." The sheriff swallowed noisily, his Adam's apple bobbing. Then he shook his head repeatedly. "But I won't. That bastard Bull had this coming for many years. We all knew it. It's just that nobody had the courage to face him." The stranger nodded briefly and began walking back toward the saloon. Clara ran toward him with tears of relief running down her cheeks and hugged him with desperate strength. "Thank you, 1,000 thanks. I thought I was going to die." He said absolutely nothing, just gave her a soft, comforting pat on the shoulder and climbed the stairs to his room. But as he slowly climbed the wooden steps, something deep inside warned him that this wasn't really over. Bull Harding had been just the beginning of something bigger. Men like him always had family, friends, allies thirsty for revenge, and what was coming on the horizon was going to be much worse. The town of Redstone breathed with temporary relief during the following days. Bull was dead and buried. His men had fled like rats or were wounded and recovering. And for the first time in many long years, people could walk the streets without that constant fear oppressing their chests. But the stranger knew from bitter experience that peace never lasted long in the Wild West. There was always someone else waiting, someone seeking revenge or looking to make a name for themselves. The stranger stayed in the saloon for a complete week, helping Clara with daily tasks and keeping constantly alert. He had learned long ago through painful experiences that when you kill a powerful man like Bull Harding, there's always someone else waiting in the shadows to take his place or avenge his death. And he was right. One hot afternoon, as the sun began to set on the horizon, painted orange and purple, a lone rider slowly entered the town. He was dressed completely in black, from his wide-brimmed hat to his leather boots. A long, dark duster coat brushed the dusty ground as he rode. His face was covered by a beard, black as coal, and his eyes were as cold and hard as tempered steel. He stopped right in front of the saloon and dismounted with slow, deliberate movements. Everyone on the street stood completely still, watching him with growing nervousness. There was something about this man that radiated danger, something that made people instinctively step back. The man in black entered the saloon with heavy steps that resonated on the floor. The place was full of people drinking carelessly and playing cards, but when they saw him enter, all noise stopped abruptly. Conversations died mid-sentence, cards were forgotten on tables, drinks remained untouched. The stranger was sitting at his usual table by the dirty window. He looked up calmly and observed the newcomer with a neutral expression, though his hand subtly moved closer to his weapon. The man in black walked directly toward him and stopped a few steps away. "You're the man who killed Bull Harding?" It wasn't a question, it was a cold statement of fact. The stranger nodded slowly. "That's right." The man in black smiled, but there was absolutely no humor in that smile. It was the expression of a predator who had found his prey. "My name is Silas Crow, and Bull Harding was my younger brother." The saloon fell into complete sepulchral silence. Nobody moved, nobody breathed. The air itself seemed to have frozen, and everyone instantly knew that violence was just beginning. The ghost of Bull Harding had returned in the form of his brother. The stranger leaned back calmly in his chair and carefully studied Silas Crow. He could see the family resemblance immediately, the same hard eyes, the same square jaw, the same threatening posture. But Silas seemed more intelligent, more controlled, more dangerous than his dead brother. Where Bull had been all rage and brute force, Silas was calculated precision. "I sincerely regret your loss," said the stranger with a calm voice, "but your brother deserved to die. He beat defenseless women. He was a coward." Silas clenched his fists tightly until his knuckles turned white. "That's not something for you to decide, stranger. Justice doesn't belong to you. Someone had to do it, and nobody else in this town had the courage." Silas remained silent for a long, tense moment. Then in a low, dangerous voice that could barely be heard, he said, "I'm going to give you one single chance, stranger. Leave this town right now, tonight, and maybe, just maybe, I'll let you live one more day." The stranger looked him directly in the eyes without blinking. "No." Silas laughed without any joy. It was a cold, empty laugh that chilled everyone's blood. "Then tomorrow at noon exactly," Silas said with a firm voice, "we'll meet on the main street. And this time there won't be 6 cowardly men, just you and me, one-on-one as it should be." The stranger nodded briefly. "I'll be there waiting for you." Silas turned around with his black duster coat billowing and left the saloon without saying absolutely anything more. As his dark silhouette slowly disappeared into the growing darkness, everyone in the saloon knew with deadly certainty that the next day, when the sun reached its highest point, one of those two men was going to die in the dust. There was no other possibility. Clara approached the stranger, trembling. "You can leave now. Nobody would blame you." He shook his head. "I can't do that, miss. I never have." That dark night, the stranger couldn't sleep for even a single minute. It wasn't from fear of death, but from the constant memories. Every time he closed his tired eyes, he saw ghostly faces from the past, men he had killed in duels, women he had loved and lost, towns he had left behind on his lonely path. He got up restlessly and went out to the narrow balcony of his room. The bright full moon illuminated the empty streets of Redstone. The wind blew gently, carrying with it the familiar smell of dry earth and wild sage. Clara climbed the stairs silently with a steaming cup of hot coffee. "I thought you might need this, sir." He looked at her gratefully and accepted the cup with a brief gesture. "Thank you, Clara." She stayed by his side, looking at the same bright stars. "Why do you do it? Risk your life for people you don't even know well." The stranger drank a long sip of black coffee and sighed deeply. "Because someone has to do it. And because a long time ago, when I desperately needed it most, nobody did it for me." Clara looked at him with genuine sadness. "What happened to you in the past?" He didn't respond immediately. Then, in a low voice loaded with pain, he said, "I had a family, a beautiful wife, a small son. We lived on a modest ranch north of here. It was a simple, hard life, but we were happy." Clara waited in respectful silence. "One day, a band of outlaws came. They wanted our cattle. My wife told them we didn't have much, but they didn't listen to reason. They beat her brutally, and when I tried to defend her, they shot me and left me for dead in the dust." His hands trembled slightly around the hot cup. "When I woke up, they were already gone. My wife was dead, my son too, and I couldn't do anything to save them. That's when I learned that sometimes someone has to stand up to evil, even if it costs them everything." The sun was exactly at the top of the sky when the stranger came down the stairs. The saloon was completely empty. The entire town was outside, nervously waiting for the inevitable confrontation. He walked toward the main street with slow but firm steps. His black hat cast a dark shadow over his weathered face. His hand rested naturally near his silver revolver. Silas Crow was already standing there in the middle of the dusty street, his arms crossed over his chest. He wore the same black outfit from the night before, and his expression was hard and implacable as mountain rock. The stranger stopped exactly 20 meters away. Both looked at each other fixedly without blinking. The wind blew gently, lifting a cloud of dust between them. "Last chance," Silas said with a voice cold as ice. "Leave right now, and you'll live." The stranger shook his head. "I can't do that." Silas nodded slowly. "Then may God have mercy on your soul." Both moved their hands to their weapons. Time seemed to stop completely. The entire world was suspended in that moment. And then, in an explosive instant, both drew. Bang, bang. 2 shots resonated in unison, tearing through the silence. Gunpowder smoke rose in the hot air, and for an eternal moment nobody knew who had fallen. The smoke slowly dissipated. Both men were still standing with revolvers still in their hands. Then Silas Crow took a staggering step forward. His face contorted in intense pain. He looked down and saw the red stain spreading rapidly across his black chest. He fell to his knees and the stranger holstered his weapon. Silas Crow fell to the ground with a dull thud. The stranger walked toward him and knelt beside the dying man. Silas looked at him with eyes already losing the brightness of life. "You should have listened to me," the stranger murmured. Silas coughed blood. "Bull was all I had left." "I know. But he chose his path, and that path led him to death." Silas slowly closed his eyes and stopped breathing. The stranger stood up as the townspeople cautiously approached. The sheriff put a hand on his shoulder. "You did the right thing, stranger." But the stranger didn't feel victorious, only tired, bone-deep tired from all the death, all the violence. Clara ran to him and hugged him. "Stay with us, please." He shook his head. "I can't. Death follows me wherever I go." "But you're safe here now." "No, Clara, what this town needs is peace, and I can never give that. My presence will only bring more violence, more men seeking revenge or trying to make a name for themselves." Without more words, he went to the stable, prepared his horse, and rode out of Redstone as the sun began to set. The townspeople watched him go, some with sadness, others with relief. For years, he continued his lonely path, helping those who needed it, standing up to bullies and outlaws. In each town, he left his mark. Some remembered him as a savior, others as a legend, and some simply as a ghost that appeared when justice was needed most. He never returned to Redstone, but sometimes on quiet nights he thought about Clara, about her smile, about the peace he could never have. He wondered if she had found happiness, if she had married, if she remembered the stranger who had saved her life. One day, while riding along a lonely road through the desert, he saw some bandits harassing a family. A man, a woman, and 2 small children were surrounded by 3 armed men. Without hesitation, he dismounted and pulled out his revolver. "Let those people go," he said, his voice carrying the authority of countless similar confrontations. And so, once again, the story repeated itself. Because that was his destiny, the silent guardian of the West, the man with no name, the wandering vigilante. And as long as there was injustice, he would be there, because that was his redemption, his only path forward, the endless path of a man seeking to atone for the family he couldn't save by saving others. The years passed, and the stranger became more legend than man. Stories were told in saloons about the mysterious gunslinger who appeared from nowhere to defend the innocent. Some said he was a ghost, others claimed he was an angel of vengeance. But those who had seen him knew the truth. He was just a man, broken by loss, trying to make the world a little less cruel, one town at a time. And somewhere in the vast expanse of the American West, he rides still, his silver revolver ready, his grey eyes scanning the horizon for the next person who needs a guardian, the next town that needs justice. Because in the Wild West, there will always be those who prey on the weak, and as long as they exist, there will be a need for someone willing to stand against them. The stranger's story has no real ending, because justice has no ending. It continues day after day, sunset after sunset, one act of courage at a time, and perhaps that's the truest form of redemption. Not a single grand gesture, but a lifetime of small acts of bravery, each one pushing back the darkness just a little bit more. This is the legend of the man with no name, the stranger who decided to intervene, who chose to stand between evil and innocence, no matter the cost. His story echoes through the canyons and across the prairies, carried on the desert wind, inspiring others to stand up, to be brave, to protect those who cannot protect themselves. And in the town of Redstone, they still tell the story of the day a stranger walked into the Broken Horseshoe Saloon and changed everything. The day someone finally said, "Enough" to Bull Harding. The day justice came to town wearing a dusty coat and carrying a silver revolver.